The International Monetary Fund has warned that the economic fallout from COVID-19 could make the 2008 financial crisis and even the Great Depression look tame. Their best-case scenario, a 3% decline in the global economy. Is this pessimism justified? What about stimulus measures? Will they work as well under these extraordinary circumstances? And is anyone thinking about the global south? And coming up later, claims that China is trying to control the coronavirus narrative surface again in some foreign media. Is it a genuine issue or the latest chapter in attempts to blame China for their own outbreaks? Welcome to The Point, coming to you from Beijing. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. As much of the world remains in lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic, national economies are in crisis. On Tuesday, the International Monetary Fund warned that the global economy is set to experience its worst recession since the Great Depression, and governments around the world are scrambling to contain the economic fallout. What's different this time? How will the crisis impact lives? And how should governments and international organizations respond? To discuss these questions and more, I'm joined via Skype by Doug Henwood, an economic journalist and host of the radio show Behind the News in New York City. And on the phone from Shanghai, Mr. Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novum Arcade Technologies. Thank you both for being here, gentlemen. I want to go to you first, Doug. A negative 3% growth. That is dramatic. I mean, a 6 percentage point decline from the IMF's January forecast over there you see in the picture. First of all, I want to get your take on this forecast. What do you think of the IMF's projections?
Well, their forecasts are based on the idea that there'll be a relatively quick recovery from the disease, and following that, a relatively quick recovery in the broad economy, not in the U.S. and around the world. I'm skeptical about both things. We really have a hard time predicting the course of the disease, but even if it does clear or begin to clear in significant ways in a relatively few months, the economic damage is going to be very, very severe. We have now the unemployment rate in the U.S. is probably going to be 15 to 20% when the job report gets released beginning of May. We're compressing an economic shock on the magnitude of what the U.S. experienced between 1929 and 32 into the space of a couple of months. It's just the most, it took 3 or 4 years for the Great Depression to unroll, and we're doing this in a couple of months. Whole businesses are shutting down, restaurants, hotels, retail stores, and it's not going to be easy to reopen those. So I think some of this damage is going to be more severe, but to the IMF's credit, it said all of the risks to their forecast are on the downside, and they did note that they were making a lot of optimistic assumptions, so I think it could well be worse than what they're forecasting, is what I'm saying.
Correct. The IMF did say that their projection is based on the baseline scenario where the pandemic will be contained in the first half of the year. And if the pandemic persists and drags on to the second half of the year, there could be alternative scenarios. And Jiahe, I want to go to you. Are you worried that the worst or worse case scenarios might become a reality? How should nations and their policymakers prepare for that?
Well, I actually do think that, China has a famous doctor called Zhang Hongwen. He's actually a very famous doctor in Shanghai regarding the pandemic things. And he has made the prediction. I think that's the prediction that we should look at, which is, I think, what will happen in the future. That he said that the pandemic will be eased a lot in the summer. It might re-emerge in autumn, but not at that larger scale, as I remembered. There are a few reasons, actually, behind this, which you look at them. The first one is the weather. The weather is really important in determining the spreading of the coronavirus. If you look at all the countries that are not suffered severely because of the coronavirus, many of them are in tropical areas, and yet there is no one tropical area country that is strongly affected because of the coronavirus. That means summer does help to contain the virus. The second is that all the countries are so aware for the moment. I mean, the coronavirus had the element of surprise in the very first place. But now everyone is so concerned. Even Italy has got the case of dropping for like a week or two. I mean, the new discovered cases has been dropped for like a week or two in Italy. So it's actually everyone is so prepared, and with the help of the summer, it's very possible for you to see the case to drop in the summer. But it might re-emerge in autumn. But as all the countries are so prepared, it can't be so serious in autumn.
Well, we do see signs of stabilization, especially in Western Europe. Doug, I want to go to you again. Countries have launched stimulus packages. Let's talk about the United States first. $2 trillion stimulus package, the largest in U.S. history. That includes a $1,000 handout to individuals, funding to small businesses. How do you expect those measures to work, especially considering the times we're living under, quarantines, lockdowns, and restricted business activities?
Well, you know, they're helpful, but there are an awful lot of problems in implementation so far. The small business assistance is nearly impossible to get, from what reports I hear. It's being administered through banks, and they're doing a very poor job of it. The amount of money that people are getting, you know, $1,200 per person, roughly, is not enough to live more than a week or two on. So people who lose their jobs are really going to have a hard time living on that stimulus check. You know, they're increasing the unemployment benefit, but it's still pretty meager. So it's certainly helpful, but it's not going to solve all our economic problems. For the longer term, the problem in the United States, and this is really far worse here than it is in other countries, I think. We have a whole bunch of problems that have made this far worse, and getting out of this problem would require some major policy changes. We have a completely collapsing physical infrastructure in the country. We have a really poor public health infrastructure. We have really, really diminished state capacity. The level of incompetence that the federal government and some of our state and local governments have shown through this is just stunning. We look with envy at some other countries in the world that have done a much better job in controlling this, responding to it. We just don't even have, you know, we had nurses in hospitals in New York City using garbage bags for protective equipment because they didn't have the proper gowns. All these kinds of things are very, very important if we want to have some kind of long-term recovery from it. So pumping a lot of cash into the system is good, but we also need to do some real sector investment, providing better hospital care, providing a better safety net, all kinds of things that are not being addressed by these bailout packages and don't seem to be under very serious consideration by our national leadership right now.
Well, Doug, you have your own talk show that is pretty popular. You talk to average Americans every day. What are their main grievances and concerns? What is the situation like on the ground?
Well, it's kind of hard to say because, you know, one doesn't get out much. I've been pretty much sealed into my apartment for the last 5.5 weeks. But I think from what I hear, people are very, very nervous about their jobs, their health. But also, I think a lot of, and people are probably underestimating this, an awful lot of psychological damage that's happening now. People are scared, confused, very stressed, and it's going to be hard to recover from that, too. People feel really battered, uncertain. Uncertainty is really pretty difficult to live with. This kind of profound existential uncertainty is very hard to live with. So, yeah, I think that's what people are worried about, all these things at once. It's just a big toxic package of disease and poverty and uncertainty. Then very, very poor leadership coming from the higher levels of government.
Well, China might be a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of epidemic prevention and control. Jiahe, I want to go to you. China, on the other hand, realizes the hit the pandemic had on the Chinese economy. That's why it tapped into its policy toolbox to boost the economy on monetary and fiscal stimulus measures. To what extent do you expect China's stimulus measures to work?
Well, currently we can see that China has been doing pretty well with its economy. The most important thing is that China has been successfully containing the coronavirus within just a month and a half. And amid that a month and a half, there is also one Spring Festival, which means usually factories would shut down for like 2 weeks. It's a Chinese tradition to celebrate for the Spring Festival. So totally speaking, Chinese economy has been shutting down for like a month or maybe 5 weeks, 6 weeks. That's all what has been doing. So that's the most important thing. You have to first control the virus in order to boost the economy. But China has been doing a lot of things to boost the economy as well. I mean, the PBOC has been lowering interest rate, injecting money into the open market. The fiscal policies has been taken, tax has been reduced, things like that. So if you look at all the indicators in the country right now, things like inflation, the financial market indicators, stock market, labor employment, industrial production, these things are pretty well indicating that China has been doing pretty good with fighting against the coronavirus and helping out its own economy.
That is certainly good to see. Doug, we've seen massive outflow of capitals from emerging economies to elsewhere, and there have been disruptions to global supply chains. How can we compare advanced economies to emerging markets, given the disparity in national resources to deal with the economic fallout?
Well, the emerging markets have some very serious problems. I mean, the IMF forecast is pretty harsh, not so much for Asia, but Latin America is going to get hammered pretty hard by this crisis. Commodity exporters are going to do quite poorly because of the decline in commodity prices. Oil is way down, but other commodity prices are falling as well. They really, a lot of emerging market countries don't have the state infrastructure to deal with a pandemic like this. You know, Haiti, for example, has, there are like 50 ventilators in the whole country. When as the disease spreads, the poorest countries are going to have a very, very difficult time coping with it. I hope the other guest is right that hot weather is good, because some of the poorer countries are the hotter countries, and I hope that climate effect reduces the spread of the disease. But we don't really know, that we don't have the data infrastructure, and we still don't know whether what kind of effect hot weather does have on this virus. So we're hoping for the best, but I'm not sure we're preparing for the worst just yet. But yeah, it's bad news for the poorer countries in the world, because they have debt problems, they have capital outflow problems, they have export problems, and they have state capacity problems. All those things are going to be a very severe challenge for the global South.
Well, there are bad news. For example, rising borders, halted trade and commerce, and rising xenophobia and nationalism. Jiahe, do you think COVID-19 will disrupt or even destroy the global supply chain as we know it?
Well, personally speaking, I don't really think so. I mean, the global supply chain is now very strong. I mean, if you look at all the countries participating in the global economy, China produces so many parts for the Apple phone, and the United States is earning money by selling the phone back to China, and Japan has so many Chinese tourists. So if you look at all economies, you have a very strong global supply chain compared with like 100 years ago or even 60 years ago. So it is really strong for the moment. And a very important thing is that the coronavirus is not going to be last there like what the AIDS has been doing. The AIDS has been in our societies for like half a century or something. But the coronavirus can't be there for so long. I mean, it's a short-term epidemic. It can be there. I mean, it's been in China for like 2 months, a month and a half or 2 months. And if you look at the cases in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, even in the United States, you can see the new discovered cases are starting to drop. That means people are doing their job. So I would say this will be controlled maybe in the next few months. It's a very short period of time for you to disrupt the whole global supply chain.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this discussion. I want to thank both of my guests for joining us, Jiahe and also Doug Henwood. Thank you so very much. Come back again. And we'll take a short break. We'll be back right after this.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
As new infections decline, China's efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic seem to have paid off. But some governments and media networks are now accusing China of trying to, quote, control the coronavirus narrative. What is this narrative? And if so, who started it? It is just another attempt by some countries to blame China for their own failures to contain the outbreak. To find out, I'm pleased to be joined via Skype by Wang Cong, chief reporter of the Global Times in Beijing, and from Tennessee by Professor Joseph Mahoney of the East China Normal University. Welcome, gentlemen. Professor Mahoney, let me go to you. On the same day, 2 Twitter accounts, one for the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka and one for the Chinese ambassador to Cyprus, were suspended by Twitter. A few hours after this, his account was restored, Ambassador to Cyprus of China, Huang Xingyuan, tweeted, after the suspension of my Twitter account on April 13th without prior notice, on the grounds of, quote, violating Twitter rules, It has been restored this morning. Twitter explained that it was flagged as spam by mistake. Twitter gave the same reason for the suspension of the other Chinese account. Is that just coincidence? If not, who is really trying to control this narrative? Professor Mahoney.
I think it's not in these two cases. Yes, I think it's not very clear in these two cases. It could be coincidence, but at the same time, we know that Twitter and Facebook have been in the press for, struggling over the question of freedom of speech versus the need to try to deal with fake news in a period of time when fake news can be deadly, and in the case of a virus and outbreak information. But at the same time, both Twitter and Facebook have faced increasing regulatory threats from the U.S. government. And, the U.S. government, both on the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, are very much wedded to an anti-China narrative. So, it's hard to say. It's not surprising that people would be suspicious, but I'm not sure what the case is in these specific instances.
Well, there are many competing narratives out there. I want to go to my colleague Wang Cong in Beijing. We have data from two separate research projects, one undertaken by New York's Mount Sinai Hospital, showing that the first cases of COVID-19 in New York City are primarily from European and U.S. travelers. There are many theories floating around about where the virus originated, some of which are repeated by government officials and media. But isn't this a matter for scientists, not politicians, to determine? So why are people who are not qualified to comment on such issues being so vocal about it?
Well, politics and blaming game, as you pointed, these are theories, and there are a lot of theories, and a lot of them have nothing to do with science. And this all started with the White House, how they painted the whole pandemic as something that China created, in the White House, in the U.S. Congress, that it was somehow that a lab in Wuhan, spread this. So it all started from there, and then it kind of got a snowballing effect. Everybody jumped on because this is a sensational story. So all the U.S. media got on. So then where we're at, like you said, this is a purely scientific issue, and there are a lot of research and development has to be done to trace the origin of the coronavirus. However, this is not the top priority for now, not for anybody, not for the U.S., not for China, not for the world, because right now it's the focus should be on the containment in the U.S. It's the mitigation. So it is really unhelpful, but we have to say it's unfortunate. It started with U.S. politicians, elected officials in the Congress spreading basically conspiracy theories, and then the White House, start with President Trump, who called it Wuhan virus, because this is not about when Trump used it. This is not about where it came from, and it's scientific. It would help the anti-epidemic efforts. It's about shifting blames, because we're seeing what's happened in the U.S. It's unfortunate, but it has a lot to do with their policy, their botched policy. So that's where we begin. That's where we're at. Very unfortunate, actually.
Talking about shifting blames, Professor Mahoney, the White House decided to halt funding to the WHO, criticizing the organization of covering up the outbreak and favoring China at the expense of America. How should we interpret that narrative of the White House? I mean, why the stopping of the funding now?
Well, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was a public health officer with U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And one of the things that struck me in my tenure there was how intensely political public health always is. I mean, we would think that it would, categorically be something scientific, that is fundamentally medical, that's fundamentally concerned about people's well-being, but it is always political. It's always ideological. Now, in the broader sense, to build on some of what the other guest has mentioned, before the outbreak, there was already this entrenched anti-China narrative, and it was really being driven by two things. One is this deep fear that Trump has tried to exploit and has built his whole brand on, this Make America Great Again campaign, because there was this fear and perception that America was in some form of decline. Meanwhile, China has been rising. And so it's been very convenient to blame China for exploiting, for taking advantage of the United States and pushing the U.S. down on its way to rise. And of course, this has continued under the outbreak with COVID-19. As the other guest noted, we have had not a very good response here to the outbreak, and there have been trenchant efforts to blame others. This includes, of course, as we've already noted, blaming China, but now blaming WHO. And you almost saw this being tested in, a few balloons went up a week or so ago, and it took hold in the conservative media. And once he saw that was going to be popular, then he came back to it, despite saying that he wasn't going to suspend. So it's a scapegoat for our own shortcomings, and in particular, some of the blame that's now coming back to rest on his shoulders for deal with this on the front end.
Wang Cong, some overseas Chinese have experienced unfair treatment as a result of the outbreak, being harassed, called names, even attacked at times. Do you think the anti-China narrative pushed by Washington and echoed by some mainstream U.S. media made racism there worse?
Well, definitely start with the name calling, Chinese virus. Of course, that kind of fear-mongering names and, headlines would, further worsen those paranoia and fear already, held by many in the United States. So with the types of rhetoric in the news media and in the White House top officials, officially it gives, I'm not going to say it's a green light, but it kind of helps them. It kind of, push these people to further into their, paranoia of China rising, and China is this evil country that is spreading this virus to kill everybody. I mean, it's just ridiculous when I see some of these news reports, because they would not, including U.S. mainstream media, what they would print about China, what's happening here, they would never print those about the within the U.S. because they will be challenged, because there will be protest. But here in China, it seems that they can print anything, anything about about anything here, and they will not get challenged by it. So that's why it kind of led this spread of in the U.S. media, it's anti-China, ideologically based, and then that kind of shifted it towards paranoia and this racism. So they do have to bear the the blame for these types of rhetoric, because they created the overall environment, the political environment about people's perception of China, Chinese people, even the Asian communities there. So,
Professor Mahoney, this is the question I've always wanted to find answers to. America and American NGOs have been, let's be honest, generous on many occasions through the past century in rebuilding its allies, offering aid to poor countries globally. USAID comes to mind. Why is it that when the U.S. is doing this, it's called international development, and when China does it, it's called propaganda and influence peddling?
Well, I think it's really difficult to rationalize behavior that at this point has become pathological. Fear and paranoia about China, as I mentioned earlier, pre-existed the outbreak, and it is only intensified with it. So, anything that China does at this point is being looked at suspiciously. And again, this is by a lot of, and I'm speaking primarily from the American perspective, a lot of Americans who ought to know better. I hate to turn this into a personal thing, but I've lived in China for the better part of 20 years. It's an area of expertise for me academically. I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the United States who've never been to China, and they consistently want to explain to me what the real China is, even though all of their information is coming from second, third, fourth hand. All of it's coming through these various filters that are feeding on this fear and paranoia. And I think the real fundamental issue is people are terrified of looking at themselves. They're terrified of looking at themselves critically and trying to figure out what they have done wrong and what their responsibility is for fixing things, because they don't really have good answers to that at this point.
Well, Wang Tong, in Beijing, there are reports in some parts of the foreign media saying that some countries praise China because they get aid from China. By that logic, wouldn't every country offering aid be engaging in bribery? I mean, why is China singled out for helping other countries?
Yeah, you mentioned that it's very important because they say praise China. They didn't use the word bribery, but that's what they're insinuating by printing all these stories. It's somehow that there's a quid pro quo going on where China sending masks, and then in return you have to say something positive about China and about China's efforts. However, that's not happened. They know it because they have never, of all the hundreds of articles printed about China, using the mask as a diplomatic tool, they have never provided any evidence of China asking specific country or official to praise China, as a condition to offer assistance. They have never. They said French government may have been pressured, but they come out and denied it. So it is very delicate. They know that what they're printing is not right. That's why they say they demand praise because China helped them. They didn't say bribery or as a quid pro quo, but that's what they're insinuating. And this is what I don't get. And a couple of questions. If China stops to sending masks to these countries, who would step in? I mean, U.S. has been the leader for the last few decades, to helping in terms of international crisis, but it has not. It has not. It has been focused on the domestic, and also it has been playing a counterproductive role in this crisis. So China has to step up. If China didn't step up, not only that people on the front line, medical workers, China sends millions of masks each day. If they don't have masks, what would that do? What would that do to healthcare workers around the world? And then this thing about China using this to gain influence. These things happen naturally. Nobody anticipated this. China, in the officials and the public have been talking to, nobody's viewing this as a way of showing China's strength. More so, it's about humanity. People are proud of how China is conducting itself out of this. So I don't get it. It's not about influencing. It's about the natural process. We're helping.
Wang Tong, my friend, thank you so much for your perspective. And also I want to thank Joseph Mahoney. And that would do it for this edition of The Point. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download the CGTN app to watch our show. I'm Wang Guan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.